This week, China achieved something it had never done before, recovering an orbital class rocket booster. And at almost exactly the same time, SpaceX completed the final major engine test for the next Starship flight. So, is China finally catching up with SpaceX in the battle for the Moon and Mars? Let's start at Starbase. Ship 40 has now completed 2 major engine tests ahead of Starship Flight 13. First, SpaceX performed a single-engine static fire. Then Ship 40 completed an impressive 60-second full-duration static fire using all 6 of its Raptor engines. And now Booster 20 has passed its biggest test as well. On July 10, SpaceX ignited all 33 Raptor engines on Booster 20 during a full-duration static fire on Pad 2. The test appeared to go extremely well, and SpaceX quickly confirmed its successful completion. This means that both Ship 40 and Booster 20 have now completed their major pre-flight engine tests. Technically, the hardware for Starship Flight 13 is almost ready. A possible launch date of July 15 is currently circulating, meaning Flight 13 could happen as early as next week. However, this date is not yet completely final, and SpaceX still needs all regulatory approvals following the Flight 12 mishap investigation. Flight 13 will be especially important because Flight 12 produced mixed results. Ship 39 reached space, deployed its Starlink simulators and completed a controlled re-entry and splashdown. But Booster 19 experienced problems during its boost-back burn and failed to perform the planned controlled splashdown. So Flight 13 will give SpaceX another opportunity to prove that the upgraded Starship version 3 architecture can perform reliably from launch all the way through re-entry. And while SpaceX prepares for another Starship flight, China has just achieved a historic breakthrough of its own. On July 10, China launched a new Long March 10B rocket from Hainan. The rocket successfully placed an experimental payload into orbit, but the real highlight came roughly 6 minutes after launch. For the first time, China successfully recovered the first stage of an orbital class rocket. And China did not simply copy the Falcon 9 landing method. Instead of touching down on landing legs, the booster descended toward a floating recovery platform at sea. Special catching mechanisms on the booster engaged with cables and a giant net mounted on the platform. The net absorbed the final movement and secured the booster. The main advantage is weight. Landing legs are heavy, and every kilogram added to the booster reduces the payload that can be carried into orbit. By removing the legs and catching the rocket externally, China hopes to increase payload capacity while still making the booster reusable. The Long March 10B can reportedly carry at least 16 metric tons into low Earth orbit. That puts it in a similar general class to Falcon 9, although Falcon 9 can carry more when flown expendably. China has been developing reusable rocket technology for close to a decade, and there have already been unsuccessful landing attempts by other Chinese rockets. This successful recovery is therefore a major turning point. But what exactly is the Long March 10B? It is part of China's new Long March 10 rocket family. 10B is primarily designed for launches into low Earth orbit, including satellites and potentially China's future large satellite constellations. The larger Long March 10 configuration will use 3 booster cores and is being developed to launch China's next generation crew spacecraft toward the Moon. China's official goal remains to land astronauts on the Moon before 2030. So the rocket recovered this week is not itself the complete triple-core Moon rocket, but its engines, structures and reusable technologies can directly support the wider Long March 10 program. And after the Moon, Mars is clearly part of China's long-term ambitions. China has already landed a rover on Mars and plans a Mars sample return campaign. A reusable heavy-lift architecture could eventually make larger and more frequent Mars missions possible. But does this mean China has caught SpaceX? Not yet, not even close. SpaceX first landed an orbital-class Falcon 9 booster in 2015. Since then, it has completed hundreds of successful booster recoveries, reflown individual boosters dozens of times, and built an entire launch business around rapid reuse. SpaceX has also already caught Super Heavy boosters directly with the Mechazilla launch tower. and Starship is designed to go one major step further, making both stages fully and rapidly reusable. China has now demonstrated one successful recovery. This is a huge achievement, but it still needs to inspect the booster, refurbish it, fly it again and repeat the process reliably. So SpaceX remains far ahead operationally. However, China has now shown that it can develop its own alternative recovery method and that it is learning extremely quickly. And this brings us to NASA's Artemis program. Former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine recently criticized NASA's current lunar landing architecture. His main concern is complexity. During Apollo, one Saturn V launched the command module and the lunar module together. Artemis, by comparison, depends on multiple independently developed systems. NASA needs SLS and Orion. It needs new spacesuits. It needs either SpaceX's Starship HLS or Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander. And in the case of Starship, multiple tanker launches will be needed to refuel the lunar lander in Earth orbit before it can travel to the Moon. Bridenstine argues that neither Starship HLS nor Blue Moon is currently as major as Orion, and that the large number of launches and orbital refueling operations creates additional risk. He warned that this complexity could eventually come back to bite NASA, especially while China is moving toward a crewed moon landing before 2030. And to some extent he has a point. If the only objective were to put 2 astronauts on the Moon as quickly as possible, a smaller and simpler lander might offer a faster path. But Artemis is not supposed to be Apollo 2.0. NASA does not simply want to plant another flag, take photographs and leave. The long-term objective is to create a sustained human presence around and on the Moon, build infrastructure, develop a lunar economy, and prepare for future missions to Mars. And for that objective, reusable systems are essential. A smaller, expendable lander might reach the Moon sooner, but Starship could eventually deliver enormous amounts of cargo, habitats, vehicles and equipment to the lunar surface. Blue Moon is also being developed as part of a reusable transportation architecture. So Bridenstine is probably right about the short-term schedule risk, but NASA may still be following the correct long-term strategy. The challenge is surviving the difficult transition from an Apollo-style mission to a reusable lunar transportation system. And finally, here are some quick updates from the wider new space economy. Rocket Lab is now targeting the 4th quarter of 2026 for the first launch of its reusable Neutron rocket. The maiden flight was delayed after a first stage tank test problem. Rocket Lab decided to manufacture and test a replacement rather than rushing toward launch. Neutron is designed to compete in the medium lift market currently dominated by Falcon 9. And Rocket Lab has already signed several launch agreements for the new rocket. Intuitive Machines is preparing IM-3 for the second half of 2026. The Nova Sea lander will target Rainier Gamma, one of the Moon's most unusual magnetic regions. It will carry NASA instruments, small rovers and other international and commercial payloads. No precise launch date has yet been publicly confirmed. And Firefly Aerospace is preparing Blue Moon Ghost Mission 2, officially named Riders on the Storm. The mission is targeting no earlier than late 2026 and will attempt the first American commercial landing on the far side of the Moon. Blue Ghost will travel together with Firefly's Elytra orbital vehicle. Elytra will provide communication support, deploy additional payloads in lunar orbit, and help enable operations on the far side, where direct communication with Earth is impossible. After Blue Ghost Mission 1's highly successful landing, Firefly may currently have one of the most mature commercial lunar lander platforms in the industry. So this week delivered one very clear message. SpaceX remains the leader in reusable rockets. But China is no longer simply watching from the sidelines. Rocket Lab is building Neutron, commercial companies are racing back to the Moon, and China has now recovered its first orbital booster with an entirely new catching system. The new space race is accelerating and the battle for the Moon and Mars has only just begun. And before we wrap up, one more recommendation. SpaceX has just released a brand new episode of its official Starship documentary series called Critical Path. If you're fascinated by Starship development, this is definitely worth watching. The documentary takes you behind the scenes during the final days leading up to the first Starship V3 launch and gives an incredible look at the teamwork, engineering challenges and decision making that happen before every flight. What I personally found most exciting are the detailed behind-the-scenes shots of Launchpad 2 and the entire launch infrastructure. You really get a sense of the enormous effort required to prepare the world's most powerful, fully reusable rocket for launch. I highly recommend watching it if you're interested in how SpaceX is building the future of spaceflight. And as always, if you enjoyed this week's update, don't forget to like, subscribe, and I will see you next week for another episode of This Week in Space. Thanks for watching.